My father slammed the leather folder onto the glass table so hard that one of the financiers across from me flinched and knocked over his water. I didn't flinch. I'd spent 29 years learning not to flinch when that man raised his voice, and the last 6 building something he could never touch. He told me in front of 2 senior lenders from a Bay Street fund that I was going to sign over 51% of my firm to my brother and name him managing partner by end of day, or he'd phone the man who owned the building and have me thrown out onto King Street by Friday. My mother stood behind him with her arms folded and that small, satisfied curl at the corner of her mouth I'd seen my whole life. I set down my pen, folded my hands, and told him to go ahead. Make the call, put it on speaker so everyone could hear. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned the building he was threatening me with. I owned it outright. And before I tell you how that morning ended, do me a favor and let me know in the comments which part of Canada you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you've ever had family decide your worth was negotiable. Let me back up, because the folder wasn't the start of anything. It was just the day it all finally cracked open. My name is Naomi Vance. I'm 31 and I run a real estate development and investment firm out of a converted heritage warehouse in downtown Toronto. We take old industrial buildings nobody wants and turn them into mixed-use spaces that make money for the people who trust us. I started it at 25 with a line of credit, a borrowed desk, and the kind of stubbornness you only develop when you've been told no by the people who were supposed to say yes. By the morning my father showed up, we managed a portfolio worth a little north of $200 million, and I had just spent 4 months structuring a development financing deal that would have made the whole previous year look like a warm-up. The 2 men sitting across from me that Tuesday were the deal. Call them the lenders, because that's what they were to me. Though one of them, a quiet man named Mr. Tessier, had become something close to a friend over the negotiations. We were minutes from closing. My team had been at the office until 2 in the morning the night before. There were 11 binders on that table and a bottle of decent champagne in the fridge that my assistant had already started chilling, which tells you how confident we were. I had the executed copies in front of me and the pen in my hand. Then the elevator doors opened down the hall, and I heard my mother's voice carrying across the floor, asking my receptionist where she could find Naomi's office, in the tone of a woman who already believed she was being kept from something she was owed. I knew that voice. I'd have known it underwater. My stomach did the thing it always did, that old reflexive clench, before my brain caught up and reminded me that I was 31 and this was my building. The 3 of them came in without knocking. My father first, in the suit I happened to know he could no longer afford because I'd seen the second mortgage filing on his house come across a database my analyst subscribes to. My mother behind him, clutching a handbag like it was a flotation device. And my brother last, ambling in with his hands in his pockets, looking around my conference room the way you'd look at a place you were planning to redecorate. My brother is 2 years younger than me. He'd written the Chartered Accountant exams twice and the CFA Level 1 3 times and passed exactly none of them. And yet he carried himself like the smartest man in any room he walked into, because that's how he'd been raised to feel. My parents had spent their lives clearing every obstacle out of his path and stacking them in front of mine. And somewhere along the way, they'd convinced themselves that his failures were just bad luck, and my successes were something I'd stolen from him. "We need to talk," my father said, ignoring the 2 men at the table entirely. "Privately. Although, frankly, your guests might as well hear what kind of person they're doing business with." I kept my voice level. "Gerald. I'm in the middle of a closing." I used his first name on purpose. I'd stopped calling him Dad years ago, in my own head first and then out loud, because the word implied something he'd never earned. That landed. His jaw tightened. My mother stepped forward and put her hand flat on the glass table, leaving a print on the surface my cleaners had polished that morning. "Don't you dare speak to your father like that," she said, "after everything we sacrificed for you." And then my father opened the folder. Inside was a contract. a real one, drafted by someone, with my firm's name on it and a signature line for me and an ownership transfer clause that would have handed my brother 51% of the company I'd built from a borrowed desk. There was a separate page naming him managing partner, effective immediately. The whole thing was so far beyond delusional that I almost laughed, except I'd learned a long time ago that my family's delusions had teeth. Your brother needs a real position, my father said. He's been struggling. It's time this family pulled together. You've had your fun playing businesswoman, Naomi, but he's the one who carries the name, and it's embarrassing watching him flounder while his sister hoards everything. You'll sign this. You'll make him managing partner, and you'll start treating him with the respect he's owed. I looked at the contract. Then I looked at my brother, who had drifted over to the window and was looking out at the lake with the contented expression of a man imagining his own future office. Then I looked at Mr. Tessier, who had gone very still, and at his colleague, who had pulled out his phone but wasn't dialing anyone, just holding it, the way people do when they don't want to seem like they're recording, but they absolutely want to be ready to. Let me make sure I understand, I said. You walked into my office in the middle of the most important closing of my year, and you'd like me to hand the majority of my firm to a man who has failed every professional designation he's ever attempted, because you've decided he carries the name. Is that the shape of it? It's about family, my mother said. Loyalty. You owe us. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. The least you can do is take care of your brother. There it was. The word she always reached for when she wanted something. Loyalty. I felt the old anger rise, but it came up cold this time, not hot, and that was new. Loyalty, I repeated. You want to talk to me about loyalty in front of clients in the building I own? All right, let's talk about my third year at Western when I came to you with the line of credit paperwork because the bank wanted a cosigner and you said no. You told me. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me. You told me women shouldn't take on that kind of debt. You told me to find a husband with a future instead of chasing a man's career. You told me I was a poor investment. And then, that same fall, you remortgaged the house to buy him a Range Rover for his 23rd birthday and to pay a private tutor $40,000 to drag him through a program he failed anyway. My mother's face went the color of brick. He needed the right environment to succeed. I worked 3 jobs, I said. I was a barista at 6 in the morning and I tutored undergrads at night and I did weekend reception at a law office and I ate the same lentils for 2 years and I paid off that line of credit myself, every dollar. And you have the nerve to come into my office and lecture me about what I owe. My father's chest puffed out the way it always did right before he reached for the threat that had worked on me when I was small. Sign the contract, Naomi. Don't make this difficult. You think you're untouchable in your fancy glass box, but you've forgotten who you're dealing with. I know people in the city. I have a relationship with the man who owns this building. If you don't transfer this firm to your brother in the next 5 minutes, I'll have your lease terminated and you'll be carrying your things out in the slush by the weekend. And there it was, the bluff. The card he'd been holding the whole time, so proud of himself, so certain. I stood up, slowly. I buttoned my blazer. You have a relationship with the owner of this building. A close one. Then by all means, I said, and I slid my desk phone across the glass toward him. Call him, right now. I'll even put it on speaker so my clients can hear exactly how you're going to have me evicted. Go ahead. He hesitated for exactly half a second. I watched it happen, the flicker of doubt, and then his pride swallowed it whole, because his pride always did. He pulled out his own phone, found a contact, and dialed, holding it up like a man revealing a winning hand. My mother smiled. My brother turned from the window. The phone rang twice on speaker. Then a voice answered, a man's voice, warm and a little wary. Gerald, the voice said, this is a surprise. What can I do for you? My father straightened. Walter. Good. Listen, I've got a situation with one of your tenants. My daughter runs a firm in your building on King, and she's gotten herself into some trouble financially and otherwise. And I think it's time you and I discuss terminating her lease before it reflects badly on the property. As a personal favor between friends." There was a long pause on the line. "Gerald," the voice said carefully, "I think there's been a mix-up. I manage that building. I don't own it." My father's smile didn't move yet. "Of course you do. You've owned it for." "I'm the property manager, Gerald. I work for the owner. I report to her." Another pause. "Your daughter is my employer. Naomi owns the building. She bought it 3 years ago. I've been working for her ever since." The room went so quiet I could hear the HVAC. I watched my father's face come apart in stages. First the smile, which simply slid off, then the color, then something deeper, some structural thing behind his eyes, the certainty he'd carried into my office, the certainty he'd carried his entire life, just buckling. The phone trembled in his hand. "That's not," he started. "And Naomi asked me to pass along." The voice continued, gentler now, almost apologetic, "that if the three of you aren't out of her offices within 10 minutes, building security has been instructed to call the police and have you removed for trespassing. I'm sorry, Gerald. Take care of yourself." The line went dead. I had not, in fact, asked him to say that. Walter had improvised the last part, and I made a mental note to give him a raise. The beep of the disconnected call hung in the air. My mother had gone gray. My brother's mouth was slightly open. And my father stood holding his phone like it had turned into something he didn't recognize, staring around at the heritage brick and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the lake beyond them. Finally understanding the size of what his daughter had built without him, around him, despite him. I picked up the contract, walked to the shredder in the corner, and fed it through one page at a time while they watched. Then I turned to the two lenders who were sitting there with the stunned, delighted expressions of men who'd come expecting a closing and gotten a closing plus a show. "I'm so sorry, gentlemen," I said. "Family, shall we finish?" Mr. Tessier picked up his pen without a word and signed. So did his colleague, Naomi. "Mr. Tessier said, capping his pen, "if you handle hostile takeovers half as well as you just handled that, I think we've put our money in the right hands." We shook on the largest deal of my career while my parents and my brother stood there, irrelevant. And then my office manager appeared in the doorway and very politely informed them that their 10 minutes were nearly up. They left. I thought, foolishly, that it was over. It took my sister-in-law less than a week to remind me that my family doesn't lose. It regroups. My brother had married, 2 years earlier, a woman who worked in communications. Her name was Yvonne, and she was Perfani, the most dangerous person in the family, which is exactly why I'd kept my distance from her at the wedding and at every cramped, miserable holiday since. She built and managed reputations for a living. She knew how a story moved through a city like Toronto, how the real estate community here is small and gossipy and runs on whispers at industry mixers and posts on LinkedIn and the comment sections of local development blogs. She knew how to take a kernel of nothing and grow it into a wildfire. 6 days after the scene in my office, my analyst walked into my office holding her laptop with both hands like it might bite her. "Naomi," she said, "you need to see this. It's everywhere." It had started on LinkedIn under an anonymous account and metastasized from there into the kind of local industry blogs that pretend to be journalism and are really just engines for grievance. The post accused me of everything that would frighten the conservative, discreet people who trusted me with their money. They said I'd built my portfolio by poaching clients from a former partner I'd never had. They said I overbilled. They said I'd misled investors about returns. They invented former employees with invented quotes about 100-hour weeks and a poisonous workplace. There were fabricated reviews, fake screenshots of fake emails, a whole counterfeit history of a woman who didn't exist, wearing my name. I recognized the writing immediately, the rhythm of it, the way every accusation was phrased to sound like a brave insider finally speaking up. That was Yvonne. She'd never touch a keyboard with her own fingerprints on it, but the cadence was hers, and I'd have bet the building on it. Within 48 hours, two of my smaller investors had called asking nervous questions. A community newspaper picked up the story under a careful headline with a question mark at the end, which is how cowards launder a rumor into a fact. My phone wouldn't stop. The thing about a smear in my industry is that it doesn't have to be true to be expensive. The investors I serve value discretion above almost everything. The mere smell of scandal can make capital evaporate. I'll be honest about something here, because this is supposed to be the real version. There was an evening that week, alone in my condo with the lights off and a cold cup of coffee going colder, when I cried. Not because I believed any of it, because I understood that the same people who'd refused to co-sign a student line of credit for me were now spending real effort and real money to burn down the thing I built instead of being told no. The cruelty of it was so total and so familiar that it knocked the wind out of me. And then I got up, washed my face, and made a decision that I think is the actual lesson of this whole story. I was not going to fight a public relations war in the comments sections. I was going to take apart the foundations of their lives, brick by brick, using nothing but the truth and their own greed. Because here is what I knew that they didn't. While my sister-in-law waged her war from behind anonymous accounts, my father took his to the golf course. My father had clung to his membership at a private club north of the city for 30 years, through good times and through years when I now knew he could barely cover the dues. Because to him, perception was the only reality that counted. He knew exactly which executives drank scotch in that locker room on Thursday afternoons, and he knew that two of my oldest clients, men who ran a logistics empire and had trusted my firm with their most sensitive holdings for years, played the back nine there every week. He approached them with a rehearsed look of fatherly sorrow, fought them around, told them in the hush of the locker room that he was heartbroken to say it, but his own daughter had grown into someone he couldn't vouch for, that the rumors, sadly, had roots, that he'd seen it himself. He didn't know I'd already called those men the morning the smear broke and told them the truth, plainly, including the part about the folder and the contract and the call on speakerphone. They'd laughed. One of them had played golf with my father for a decade and had always privately found him exhausting. They thanked him for the scotch and told him nothing. But the part my father didn't see coming, the part that mattered, was happening at the same time in a leased office 2 floors above a sushi restaurant in North York. My brother, flush with the conviction that he was a legal financial titan in waiting, had used some of my parents' last money to open his own firm. He'd hung out a shingle, and in the second week of the smear campaign, he committed an actual crime. One of my clients, Mr. Tispac, Tessier's fund among them, had a major development deal in progress, a $40 million mixed-use project that had been months in the structuring. The paperwork required my signature as the managing principal of record. My brother, desperate for a marquee deal to justify his new firm's existence, forged my signature on a notice of representation and filed it, attempting to substitute his firm for mine on the file and redirect the management fees and a chunk of the capital flow. I found out when the client called me, furious, asking why I'd abandoned a $40 million project without a word. I let him finish, and then I told him in the calmest voice I had, I didn't file that. I didn't sign that. The firm that just tried to take over your deal is run by my brother, who has never passed a professional exam in his life, and he has just forged my signature on a regulatory filing, which is fraud, which is a criminal offense in this country. The line went silent. Then the client, who was nobody's fool, asked the only question that mattered. Are you telling me a man who isn't qualified just tried to hijack my project by committing forgery? I'm telling you my family is trying to use your deal as a weapon in a personal vendetta, I said. And I'm telling you it ends today. I'm calling my lawyer and the Ontario Securities Commission, and I'm filing to have that notice voided before the close of business. I did. The forged filing was voided within 72 hours. But I didn't report my brother to the police that week. Not yet, because reporting him would have ended it too cleanly, and I'd realized something cold and clear about my brother by then, His arrogance was a lever, and I knew exactly how to pull it. I had a client I'd been quietly steering away from for almost a year. I'll call him Mercer because that's close enough. Mercer presented as a slick, wealthy, charming investor with an interest in commercial real estate and an offshore structure he was eager to optimize. My compliance officer had flagged him early. The deeper we looked, the worse it got. Mercer was, beneath the watch and the handshake, a man under quiet, active investigation by the RCMP and the OSC for laundering money through exactly the kind of real estate vehicles he wanted me to build for him. Touching him would have ended my career. I'd been politely, carefully declining his calls for months, while keeping the relationship warm enough that he didn't take his business elsewhere before I figured out the cleanest way to be rid of him. Now I had a use for him. I let it slip through a junior associate I knew was leaking to my brother that I was agonizing over whether to keep Mercer because his account was worth a fortune in fees and I was terrified of losing him. I had the associate mention, in passing, near the stairwell where I knew he'd photograph it, a printed summary of Mercer's projected billings, with the eye-watering numbers right there at the top. Then I waited. It worked exactly the way I knew it would, because I'd been studying my brother's vanity my entire life. He saw a whale his sister was supposedly desperate to keep, and his ego did the rest. He didn't run a background check. He didn't have the compliance infrastructure to know that Mercer was a walking indictment, because he didn't have any compliance infrastructure at all. My father, smelling a chance to install his son as a titan and humiliate me in one move, made the introduction himself, leaning on his country club charm, promising Mercer the world, guaranteeing the offshore transfers, assuring him of discretion. Within 3 weeks, my brother's firm had taken Mercer on as a flagship client and begun, on paper, to structure exactly the kind of laundering vehicle that the RCMP had been waiting months to catch someone building. They weren't just adjacent to a crime now, they were the crime. And then my sister-in-law walked into my office and the whole thing turned. She came on a Monday morning without an appointment, in a black suit that looked less like business attire and more like armor. She bypassed my receptionist and shut my office door behind her. The hostility that had defined every interaction we'd ever had was simply gone, replaced by something flat and exhausted. She dropped a folder on my desk. Bank statements, credit applications, and a copy of a credit report with her name on it and a list of accounts she'd never opened. He used my SCN, she said. Her voice was steady in the way a voice gets when a person has done all their crying already. To open lines of credit for the firm, to guarantee leases. There's a loan against a car I've never seen. My husband stole my identity to fund the business he's using to attack you, and when I found out and confronted him, your father told me I was being hysterical and disloyal, and your mother told me a good wife supports her husband. She looked at me. I have spent 2 years being told I was part of this family. I found out last week I was just another asset on a balance sheet, the same way you were. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. I looked at this woman who had tried to set fire to my reputation, who had every reason to be my enemy, and I saw the same thing I'd been looking at in the mirror for a decade. Someone the men of this family had decided was useful, right up until she wasn't. What do you want? I asked her. I want out, she said, and I want them to face what they've done. I'll testify. To the forged signature. To the identity theft. To the Mercer introduction, which I have on email because they were too arrogant to use a phone. She pushed the folder another inch toward me. I documented all of it. I just need to know you'll protect me when it lands. I told her I would, and I meant it. She was no longer their shield. She'd become my best witness. After that, it moved fast. The way these things do once the foundation goes. The RCMP, who'd been building their case against Mercer for the better part of a year, didn't have to do much when a brand new firm started constructing the exact laundering structure they'd been hoping to document. My brother and father had handed them everything: emails, signed engagement letters, my father's voice on a recorded line promising offshore transfers. The arrests came on a Saturday evening, which is the detail my mother could never forgive because it was the evening of my brother's grand celebration. They'd booked a room at a hotel banquet hall to launch the firm officially, a real event, a string quartet, a cake with the new company logo and fondant, the whole pageant my mother had been denied when each of her sons' careers quietly collapsed before. She'd sent out invitations. She'd told her friends. She'd waved the photographers into position. I was there. I'd been invited, in fact, out of spite. My mother no doubt imagining me forced to watch my brother's triumph. I came. I stood at the back near the bar with a glass of wine I didn't drink, and I watched my father work the room and my brother accept congratulations and my mother glow with the maternal pride she'd been hoarding for 30 years. All of it built on a forged signature and a stolen identity and a money launderer's retainer. I looked at my watch as the quartet swung into something triumphant and my brother lifted the silver knife over the cake. I'd been told, quietly, what time it would happen. The doors opened, not gently. Several officers came through with the unhurried certainty of people who know the exits are covered. They were polite. They were thorough. They asked my father and my brother to step aside, and when my brother started to protest in his loud, entitled way about who he was and who he knew, one of the officers read him the charge, and the words fraud and forgery and facilitating money laundering landed in that quiet ballroom in front of every person my mother had invited. I'd like to tell you I felt triumphant. What I actually felt, standing at the back with my untouched wine, was something quieter and heavier. I watched my mother's face as the cameras she'd hired for the front page turned, all of them, toward her son being walked out in cuffs, and I felt the strange grief you feel when something you stopped hoping for a long time ago finally, definitively dies. They were never going to choose me. There was never a version of this where they woke up and saw me. I'd known that for years. But there's knowing and there's watching it become permanent, and that night I watched it become permanent. The collapse after that was total and required nothing further from me. My brother's firm dissolved. The identity theft and forgery charges proceeded. My sister-in-law's documentation was meticulous, and she came out of it not just unscathed, but free, which I think mattered to her more than anything. Mercer's case folded my father and brother into a much larger prosecution that I'm told is still grinding through the courts. My parents had quietly guaranteed pieces of my brother's firm with the equity in their house, against my mother's protests apparently, and when it all came down, the bank moved on the home I'd grown up in. They lost it. They lost the little cottage up north that my father had bragged about for as long as I could remember. The membership at the club lapsed, and this time there was no daughter's success to secretly draw on, because the daughter was done. My mother came to my office once more, near the end of it all. She didn't slam anything this time. She was smaller than I remembered, and she sat in the chair across my desk and cried and told me she'd made mistakes, and that family was family, and that surely, with everything I had, I could help them, pay the lawyers, cover the house, set her brother up somewhere quiet, take care of them the way a good daughter does. I let her finish. Then I told her the truth, without heat, because the heat had finally burned out of me somewhere along the way. You called me a poor investment when I was 19, I said. You spent your retirement on a son who has now lost you your house. You let your daughter-in-law's identity be stolen and told her to be loyal. You watched your husband stand in a private club and tell my clients I was a fraud, and now you want me to spend the money I'd built with my own two hands, the money you said I'd never earn, to rescue the men who tried to take everything I have. I shook my head slowly. I'm not going to spend $1 saving people who spent 30 years rooting for me to fail. She begged. I'd be lying if I said it was easy to listen to. But I'd spent my whole life confusing the difficulty of saying no with proof that saying no was wrong, and I'd finally untangled the two. I did one thing for her in the end, and I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't kindness. I had my lawyer draft a release. A clean break, legally binding, in exchange for which I would write her a single check for $1,000, the only money she'd see from me ever again. She signed away any claim, now or in the future, to my business, my buildings, my name, my success. Her hand shook and the ink ran where her tears hit the page, and she signed it, because greed and desperation had left her nothing else to bargain with. When she finished, I slid the paper to my side of the desk, handed her the check, and told her it wasn't revenge. It was the cost of taking the last weight out of my life so I'd never have to carry any of it again. She left. I haven't seen her since. My sister-in-law and I are not exactly friends, but we have dinner sometimes. Two women who were each handed a role in someone else's story and decided to walk off the set. She's rebuilding, so am I. I gave Walter, the property manager who improvised the trespassing line on speakerphone, a generous raise and a corner office, and he tells the story at the holiday party every year, and it gets better every time. Here's the thing I've come to believe: sitting in a building I own, in a city I love, in a life nobody handed me. Blood doesn't earn you a permanent seat at someone's table. We're taught that family is unbreakable, that you forgive the people who share your DNA no matter what they do, and that teaching keeps a lot of good people chained to a lot of cruelty for a lot of years, longer than they should be. The people who spend your whole life telling you you're worth nothing forfeit the right to enjoy what you build out of spite for them. You don't owe your house to the people who tried to burn it down. Drawing a hard line isn't coldness. It's the most basic kind of self-respect. And sometimes it's survival. The strongest family you'll ever have might be the one you choose, made of the people who show up when there's nothing in it for them. I stopped waiting for the ones who never would, and the day I stopped, my whole life got quieter and lighter and finally, completely mine. So tell me, down in the comments, have you ever had to draw the hard line and let go of family to protect your own peace? I read every one of these, and I think there are more of us than we know. For a long time after that night, I kept circling back to one plain fact. Nothing that happened to Gerald or to my brother was something I did to them. I handed them rope, and they tied their own knots because they couldn't imagine that a daughter they'd written off had built anything worth respecting. Gerald lost the house because he gambled it on a son who forged my name. My brother lost his freedom because his vanity was so loud he never once stopped to ask who Mercer really was. The whole collapse ran on cause and effect, clean as anything I've ever watched, and I was only the person who finally refused to keep paying for their choices the way I had for 30 years. What I've come to trust after all of it are the quiet things that don't announce themselves. I think about the launderer's money I turned down a year before any of this started, the easy fortune that would have ended me, and I'm glad I said no when no one was watching. Because who you are in the rooms with no audience is the only foundation that ever actually holds. I kept my word to Yvonne when she walked in with that folder, and I'd keep it again. You can build a portfolio worth $200 million and still lose everything that matters if you let yourself become the kind of person your enemies already think you are. I also learned that being right isn't the same as being smart about it. There was a version of me that wanted to phone the police the day my brother forged my signature and feel the hot, immediate satisfaction of it. The better version waited, read the room, understood exactly which lever my brother's pride was, and let his own arrogance do the work. Knowing when to move and when to be still cost me less and protected more. And I think that kind of patience is its own quiet form of strength. And underneath all of it, the thing that carried me was the part nobody saw, the 3 jobs. The lentils. The nights I slept 4 hours and the morning I sat in my dark condo with cold coffee, gutted, and then got up and washed my face and went back to work anyway. You don't build anything real on a good week. You build it on the bad ones, on the stubbornness that keeps showing up after the people who were supposed to believe in you have made it clear they never will. I stopped waiting for Gerald and the woman who raised me to finally see me. The day I stopped, the noise in my chest went quiet. and Walter started telling the speakerphone story at our holiday party, and my life got lighter and steadier and, at last, entirely my own. The line I drew didn't make me cold. It gave me back the room to be whole.